Hello and welcome. We'll be kicking things off here in just about 60 seconds. We're going to give it a minute for some people to trickle in. Hey, Paul. Hey, Aaron. How's it going? Ron, how's it going? If you're joining us on Zoom, you can participate in the chats. I see Ala in there. I see Mir here. It's really great to have you here. Please let me know where you're tuning in from. I'm super interested. And if you're watching on a social media platform or maybe on YouTube or something, we're not actively monitoring that chat, but there's still time to join the Zoom call. If you go to the Mastra homepage or the Luma event, you can get the link to Zoom that way if it works for you. Hey, Nop. Hey, Slabby. Okay. Matt's tuning in from Salt Lake. We've got Ala based in Germany, No from Washington. All right, so without any further ado, let's kick things off. Welcome to this workshop on how to build your first agent with Mastra. I thought a little bit before coming into here what the goal should be, what I would love you to take away from this. We're going to go for about 45 minutes, maybe an hour at tops. I want to make sure you leave with a lot of value and you get the answers you need. Fundamentally, we're here to understand agents. If you're maybe aware of agents and then you're a developer thinking you could build them, but you're not quite sure what they are or how to get value from them, by the end of this workshop, you're going to have a crisp definition of agents. You'll understand tools, MCP a little bit, and together we're going to code a social media agent that might just make us rich and famous. I'll tell you a bit more about that and what to expect in a second. What I really want to point out off the bat before we get into things is while the goal is set, how we get there is up to you. The reason we host these workshops as opposed to pre-recording videos is so that we can answer your questions and even tailor things a little bit to what it is you're interested in learning. Because I'm flying solo here today, we host these workshops every Thursday, usually myself and a guest. I can look at the chat while my guest at Mastra teaches you something. It will be quite hard for me to monitor the chat continuously while also teaching. And so for that reason, if you have a question, please utilize the Q&A format. Then I'll get a tidy list of questions. And when I take a break to look at the conversation, it'll be quite easy for me to walk through them. So, as I mentioned, we're going to eventually code an agent. The plan today is that I'm going to give you a bit of a tour of a pre-made agent. I think looking at some existing code is going to help you get up to speed more quickly. But then we're going to actually get hands on the keyboard. I'm going to do some live coding and try not to leak an API key or run into an error in the process. And you're going to watch me and you can even follow along if you like. And bear in mind, the code is not online now, but it will be at the end of the workshop, and you'll receive an email about that. We're going to build on that starting point and adapt the primitives to build an intelligent and maybe profitable social media posting agent. The idea is that we're going to code an agent that looks at Hacker News for news and hot takes, and then it's going to use a model, an LLM, to generate pithy posts and pass off these opinions as my own. But because we're sourcing from a data source, maybe we can do this at scale, keep posting to Blue Sky or even X, and profit from that sweet, sweet affiliate revenue I see people bragging about all the time. Will we succeed at becoming rich and famous? I don't know, but we will succeed at building a useful agent. If you're wondering who I am and what I'm doing here on the screen, my name is Alex. I'm a developer and a teacher. I actually joined Mastra just 3 months ago. And when I joined Mastra, I said to the team, listen, guys, I know how to code and I've made some educational content around coding before, but I don't know anything about building AI agents. And they said to me, it's okay, Alex, nobody knows about AI agents. It's such a new industry. And these last 3 months, I've been fortunate to drink from the fire hose, learn from the team, write lots of posts, do lots of demos. I'm pretty stoked to be doing this workshop because today I get to teach you all the things I've learned, and hopefully I'm going to give it to you in a much more efficient manner. You can find me on X at Booker Codes. I also post to the Master YouTube channel. So if you do have to drop off early, or maybe you just want to go into some more depth later, Unfortunately, this is my face plastered all over the channel, but you'll get an idea of the things we talk about over at the Mastra channel. And so while we're going to be learning about agents through the lens of Mastra, because of course this is a Mastra live stream, I truly think some of these fundamentals will be relevant no matter what technology stack you're using. I'm not going to waste too much time over here in whiteboard slide mode. It's really important to me that we get into the code. But I think to make this session as productive as possible, we need to talk about what is an agent exactly. It seems to be a question that plagues developers and people in the community. If you Google what is an agent, I promise you, you will get at least 5 different answers. Here's the definition I've landed on. And I landed on this definition because it's the easiest to understand. And everything you read here, you will see come to life during this workshop. An agent uses a large language model along with tools and a system instruction to work towards an open-ended goal. Guided by the system instruction, the agent dynamically decides how to approach the task, reasons for each step, decides when to call tools, and determines when it is time to stop. It's very hard to read a definition like that and it not sound a little bit abstract. That's why I think the best way to understand what an agent is to maybe reflect on agents you've already been using. Take Cursor or Claude Code, for example. These are generative programming tools. You give them a task, they use an LLM, they use different tools to read code files, write code files, make Git commits and stuff like that. And they're guided by a system instruction. A system instruction, you might have seen these leaked occasionally from different tools. You have some notion of it from other consumer tools you've used, but it's basically where it says you are a helpful coding assistant. Your task is to do this. It kind of orientates the LLM towards generally a direction, but ultimately we're guiding it towards an open-ended goal because I could ask Cursor to delete code, add code, update code, code features, refactor features. When Cursor loads, it has no idea what it's going to be doing. And that's very different, by the way, from software traditionally, where things take a predefined path. We use conditional logic and things like that to decide what functions to call when. There is no logic like that when you use an agent. The agent is the brain deciding what to do next in order to achieve that open-ended goal. Another example that's fairly accessible, I think, is if you've used a deep research tool, you give these tools a broad query. Maybe you ask it, what is the best commuter bike for Londoners in 2025? And the agent will use an LLM. It has tools to search out to the web and crawl web pages. It has a system instruction guiding it towards the outcome, right? You want a helpful, comprehensive report, that type of thing. And once again, it's completely open-ended. Everything has to be dynamic because there's no determined path through the agent. And why I am so stoked about agents is that we in the coding world, we've seen Cursor, we've seen GitHub Copilot, we've seen these things gain popularity over the last few years. It's easy to think that they are kind of old news or something. But the rest of the world, which is the mass majority of the world, haven't even started to learn about this type of stuff. There are some really cool agents. For example, Manus, this is like a general purpose agent. It can read spreadsheets, it can write emails, all that kind of stuff. There's also one I found earlier, which I'm just so charmed by. This is an agent called Jack and Jill. Jack is for helping you find a job. Jill is for helping you hire people for a job. And they almost represent the task of a human, right? They're so autonomous, they even have names like Jack and Jill. And then there's also Finn, which is a customer support agent. So if we are using Cursor for code, Intercom have a tool called Finn that helps customer support agents. And by the way, these are just like commercial public examples. There are lots of companies building agents. And it's no coincidence, by the way, they have names like Claude or Jack or Jill or Finn. It's because we as humans, our biggest advantage in the workforce is that we are autonomous. We can decide what to do. We can take action using tools. Well, agents can do that now as well. And so we give them these sort of charming names because they are almost like a human in terms of their reasoning and their ability to take action. But humans don't say you're absolutely right every time, and humans don't go off the rails. So there are some differences as well, of course. We're absolutely at the precipice. And I just wanted to put this in perspective because it is so exciting for anyone interested in building agents. It can feel like old news, But ChatGPT only came out a few years ago, and that's when it became mainstream and started to get popular traction. But if you've ever used an LLM tool, like a ChatGPT, for example, you might have seen that it just outputs raw text, and you might have wondered if you can harness that in your programs. And that's when things like structured output became a feature that allows you to get output from an LLM in a predefined structured format, like a JSON object, for example. You'll see some of that come to life today. Also, function calling, which is also known as tool calling. We'll get into this, but tools and functions are how we give a model access to things in the outside world and beyond their initial training data. A huge milestone. And by the way, don't worry about the specifics of this. I'm just painting the picture of the most important advancements that are relevant to building agents today. A huge one was the ability for models to learn. Was for models to reason and then take action. So we had React.js, and now we have React, which is the reason and take action. And then it's only in the last year or so that agent frameworks have started to gain popularity. These are things like LangChain in the Python world and Mastra in the TypeScript world. I presume you've heard of Mastra if you found this live stream, but fundamentally, Mastra is a framework for building AI-powered applications and agents using a modern TypeScript stack. And I'll be telling you more about the features and how it all works today. I'm going to take a little breather to look at the chat, and then we'll get in with a live coding example. Okay, so wish me luck because we're going to be doing some live coding here. Mastra comes with a command line interface, and it's the easiest way to scaffold and create your first agent. And so if you're following along, go into your terminal and run the following command, pnpm create Mastra at latest. You can also use npm or yarn or whatever you prefer. We're going to give our agent a name. We're just going to call it agent, and we're going to follow the default location to put the files. When you spin up Mastra, you choose a provider. So Mastra has a unified model router that gives you access to any model, whether that's from OpenAI, Anthropic, wherever, via a single unified interface. We're going to choose OpenAI because I already have a key. This is your opportunity to enter a key, but I'm going to paste an environment variable afterwards, so I'm not going to worry about that. This is a really important step. I don't know if you've used any other developer tools as MCP server before, but it's a way to give your coding agents such as Cursor or Claude Code or Windsurf specific knowledge of the developer tool and API you're using so it can better generate code and answer questions you have. We're going to enable this for Cursor, which is my weapon of choice today. You won't see it in action just yet, but you will a bit later. And so let's watch that chug along. And in the meantime, I'll just take a peek at the chat. Thanks for the luck, Justin. As a reminder, if you have any questions, you can pop them in the Q&A tab and I can look at that afterwards. I'm going to cd into the agent folder, and I'm going to do some terminal foo here to copy over an environment variable, an environment file that I prepared earlier. That looks good, but of course I can't cat it without risking showing you my keys, so we won't know until a bit later. I'm going to open this in Cursor. I have a little alias called C for this, but you can open it however you want. And I'm also going to run pnm run dev. I have a little shortcut for this as well, pnd. And this will load up the Mastra local development server. There's two components to this. One is the API. You can use this to interface with your agents over HTTP, but today we're just going to focus on using the playground. And you know, a lot of dev tools have a playground, but most of them don't feel as playful as Mastra's. And you'll see what I mean shortly. I think the best way to do this is to give you an overview of the playground, and I'll show you the code behind some of these features. Remember, the playground is a pre-built tool. Mastra, when you use Mastra, what you're doing is creating agents, and this is an interface to interact with your agents. This template comes with a predefined weather agent, and it has all those components we spoke about before, right? It has let's have a look. I'm going to just clean this up a little bit. So here's our agent. It's a weather agent. It has an LLM. We're using GPT 4.0 Mini by OpenAI. It has tools. Here's our get weather tool, and I'll explain this more in a second. It also has a system prompt, which guides it towards an open-ended goal. Here it says, you are a helpful weather assistant that provides accurate weather information, blah, 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 blah. We can tell it that we want the weather in London, which is where I'm based. And it calls out to this weather tool to retrieve the weather. Okay, I think we have to talk a little bit about tools. To illustrate this, I have open, or I thought I did. Maybe it's in my history somewhere. Yeah, I have the OpenAI dashboard open. So if you're a developer and you create an OpenAI developer account, you get access to the OpenAI playground. It's a way to experience the models through a programmatic interface as opposed to just using ChatGPT, right? But ChatGPT is using these same models, such as GPT-5. And here I can talk to the model directly, but it doesn't have all the extra consumer features ChatGPT has on top, like memory and things like that. The reason why I point this out and bring it up is because if we ask just, we're just asking GPT-5, the model, what is the weather in London? It's not going to have any idea because, as you might know, but in case you don't, models are trained on a huge amount of existing data, Wikipedia articles, Reddit threads, book export, forum conversations. And when the model comes over the factory line, and I do think about it a bit like a conveyor belt, the model comes off the conveyor belt into the hands of developers. It has a training cutoff. Anything that happens after that point, the model has no knowledge of. So if there's some breaking news, for example, it won't know. But of course, it doesn't have dynamic information either, like the current weather in London. To access that information, you have to call out to an external service. Going back to the timeline a little bit, and we talk about tool calling becoming a thing. This was the big innovation. It means that when you equip your model, in this case for a mini, with a tool like this Get Weather tool, it can determine that I just don't know what the weather is. I don't know, but I can use a tool to go and find out. And what this weather tool does, and you can scope in and play with this if you want, you click on the Tools tab and Get Weather, is it basically uses an API under the hood to retrieve the weather in a given location. I'll show you the code for that in a second. Now, I have to be honest, when I first ran this demo and I was first learning about agents, I thought to myself, is that so impressive? Like, okay, we can fetch the weather, but I could just write a function to do that. I could just use a button to do that. But where agents become really powerful, and remember, this is just a very basic example, is you can ask it things like, what is the weather in London and in San Francisco? And the model will use its reasoning capabilities and its brain, if you like, to then fetch the information using two tool calls. And so it fetched the weather in London and it fetched it from San Francisco. And now imagine 100 different things we can do. For example, list every Birmingham in the world. There is a Birmingham in the UK. I thought that was the only one. It turns out there's like, well, let's find out. But there's a lot of places called Birmingham. If I wanted to, I could ask the agent to fetch the weather for each of these locations and output it. And what this is contrived, I admit, it kind of captures, I think, some of the power. I don't have to write a for loop or something. I don't have to think about how it does this. There are all kinds of combinations of ways of using this tool. And remember, when we add more tools, the permutations become more that I can't even think about in advance, but I might want to offer my users. And so we're harnessing that power of a large language model to call different tools. And I think that's really cool. Let's take a little break to look at the chat and see if there are any questions. And then we'll move on to look at some other aspects of the playground before actually writing some code to build our own agent. I just need to be a bit mindful of time as well, because we will run out of time. Slavi asked about the the difference between MCP and an API. Don't get me started on that. I can't even tell if you're I can't even tell if you're poking fun at me or not. Where is it? I actually made a video all about that over on X. And so you can watch that if you're interested. Okay, let me show you a few more little bits and bobs here that I think are really interesting. The other aspect of using LLM directly is that they're completely ephemeral. I don't know if you know this, but when you go to ChatGPT and you tell it something like, I like dogs, or excuse me, when you go to the OpenAI dashboard, I'm always conflating ChatGPT using the GPT model, but ChatGPT is the consumer app that uses the GPT models. Here we're just using the GPT models. I say something like, I like dogs, and then I say, tell me facts about them. Because each message is self-contained and ephemeral, the model doesn't have any knowledge of the previous messages. So when I say them, it's like, what do you mean by them? Conversely, in Mastra, if I tell the agent I like dogs, I hope it knows what I mean. Tell me facts about them. There is a degree of coherence here because we have stored the previous messages. And when you send the new message, Mastra will include all of the previous messages as context. So the model can see that and give you a coherent response. The reason I illustrate this is twofold. One, if we look at the observability tab here, you can actually dig into any of these requests and get a peek at what's going on under the hood. You don't always have to think about it, and you especially don't have to think about it at the beginning, but it is helpful to know that if we poke under the hood here, you can see that this is the raw request that went to the model under the hood. Here's that system prompt. Here's that original message about the fact that we like dogs. And here's the latest message asking us for facts about them. And because this object represents the context, and you might have heard of context engineering, that is the art and the science of deciding what to put inside of this object to get the best possible outputs. Well, the model can give us a coherent response. The other reason I point this out is because realistically, if you ever build an agent, you probably want to store the messages that were sent. You do this because you want to show your users their previous messages. You do this because you want to analyze the messages to improve future outputs and maybe even train on them, or rather include them in your RAG pipeline or something like that. And with Mastra, you simply have to, and we're looking at the code for the first time now, you simply need to specify a database using the storage option like this. You can do that at the agent level, and you can also override, you can do that at the Mastra instance level, or you can dig in and do it at the agent level. The reason why I want to point out the agent level is because it stores it in a file, and we can take a little peek at what's going on in the mastra.db file. This is a cursor or VS Code extension, by the way, that lets me see databases in my editor. And we can see those threads that were listed along the left. And we can also see the messages that belong to those threads. If you're ever building an agent, you will probably need to figure out how to what is the right insertion point to look at the result from the model and put that in a database. Except if you're using Mastra, that's taken care for you. So you can taken care of for you. So you can spend more time building unique features and things like that. The really cool thing about the playground is apart from being able to sort of test and give inputs to your agent, you can also play with settings. For example, here you can change the temperature and the top P. These work in unison to combine the predictability or randomness or creativity of the model's output. You can dial those things in. You can also, if you want, dynamically change models. We won't get into this too much today, but suffice it to say, these agents are built on the big brains that are models, and some have different attributes. Some are smarter, but slower, but more expensive. Others are faster, but they don't reason as much. Oftentimes, when building an agent, you want to sort of play with different models to see what works best for you. And as I mentioned earlier, with Mastra, you can interface with any model from any provider. You don't have to write custom integration code or do any refactoring or anything. You just give it the API key and play around. And I think that's really cool to know. Let's take a quick look at the code. I've already showed you the Mastra instance. This is basically the configuration for Mastra at a high level. So we turn things on and off or give some global properties like storage or logging, things like that. The agent, you're not going to be blown away by this. The agent is rather thin in this case, and almost everything we've seen here defined in code was represented in the playground as well, including the prompt and the model and the tools we gave it. I want to give you a quick note on tools, which I think is super, super relevant because tools absolutely do look like functions. You might look at the tools tab here and think, how is this any different from a function? You give it an argument like a city name, you get an output, it's even in a JSON object format. What makes this a tool instead of just a function? Well, crucially, tools have a bit of metadata associated with them, principally the ID. Because TypeScript doesn't have any like reflection capabilities and stuff, you have to specify the ID like this, and it's very descriptive, as well as a description. This can be terse, as in this case, or it could be longer as well if you want to be more descriptive. And essentially, the model, when you give it an input, such as what is the weather, it will think to itself, I don't have any training data about that. Let me see what tools I have that could be helpful. And it will basically analyze this description to determine if the tool is relevant. And we can take this so much further as we will in this stream, because now you've got a good foundation regarding Mastra and what everything is all about. We're going to, and I can just tick all this off, we're going to move on to build this social media agent. We have about 35 minutes left, so plenty of time. I'm quite excited to get into it. We'll just take a quick break to look at the chat and see if there are any questions. There's a great question here by Mohammed about putting the agent in your own application. We're actually going to look at that towards the end of this stream. I'm going to show you how you can build that same chat interface into your own application. Miguel asked about the database tool in Cursor. I could have anticipated that to come up. I was so curious the first time I saw it as well. It's called SQLite Viewer. By the way, with Mastra, you can use SQLite, but you can also use other database engines as well. Okay, should we try and attempt some live coding? Here's the plan. We're going to copy and paste the weather agent because it has all the boilerplate we need. And we're going to rename it to be a social media agent. And by the way, let me know if you can see the code nice and clear. I can always bump it up a notch if you need me to. So let's rename this to social media agent. Call this a social media agent. We're going to delete the prompt and we're going to comment out the tools line for the time being. Before this will show up in the playground, we have to go to that index.js file where Mastra is defined, and we need to pass the social media agent as an option and import it as well. I love how this sometimes auto imports, but most of the time there's not. Or rather, Cursor has sent me. Oh, we're definitely live coding because we're stumbling over obviously wrong things, like trying to specify an agent as a workflow. There we go. I was trying to pass it as a workflow when we need to pass it as an agent. Now, when we return to the playground and look at the agents tab, you can see that in addition to the weather agent, we have a social media agent. We could delete the weather agent at this point if we want, and I can say, hello. Okay, a social media agent, what does it do? It takes our rough ideas and maybe some inspiration and generates something pithy or engaging or intriguing. How can we make sure that our agent does that? Well, it's down to the system prompt. And by the way, the act of prompt engineering, there are lots of little tactics and techniques we can use. This is definitely not something you want to delegate entirely to another model, but I find it's a very helpful way to get started to ask ChatGPT or whatever tool you're using to create a system prompt for you. Because after all, who knows system prompts better than a model? So I can say, create a system prompt for a social media posting agent. The post should fit on Blue Sky, which is 300 characters. They should be engaging, not overly promotional, and avoid hashtags and things like that. Because if we, by the way, I'll just copy this to make sure I don't lose it. But if we asked a model without any additional system prompt to generate, here's a great idea. Let's look at Anthropic's new announcement. Say we want to write a post about this. I could take the link, I could go to the playground here, and I can say, generate a tweet about this. And I can tell you what's going to happen. It's going to sound way over the top. It's going to use stupid hashtags. It's just so bad. But if we go back to Raycast here and generate a nice system prompt that asks it to avoid hashtags, this looks pretty good. And by the way, you could just give this sentence to the model, but it's a pretty oh gosh, this is looking quite long, isn't it? We're just going to go with it. Um, I'm going to make it twice as short. You can just, I noticed this with Cursor and with ChatGPT. Sometimes we write very lazy prompts. The coding agents actually use a model to turn your lazy prompt into something more detailed, and then they pass that on to the more expensive reasoning model. So it's a pretty established technique where we use a model to help refine our prompts. But as I say, you probably don't want to delegate all of this to an LLM because you might want to give it some nuanced input. And so we're going to go to the instructions here, create a new line, paste that in. And then when we go back to the agent, I'm going to reload for good measure, but you might have spotted already the system prompt here is updated in the playground. I'm going to create a new chat because remember we were talking about the agent being able to see previous messages. Often that's very useful because it gives us coherence. But when testing, I don't want that previous input to affect the result that I get here. And look at this, it's already so much better. And by the way, I didn't really talk too much about it when speaking about the opportunity for building agents and things like that. We look at the stock of something like NVIDIA, or we look at OpenAI's valuation, and we get a sense of how thrilled people are about these opportunities. And it's not, I'm not saying that we're doing this workshop to help you build a business or something necessarily, but typically you'll have some kind of business use case. You think, well, what are we building on top of the model? Are they doing all the heavy lifting? Prompts are part of your product. Like this is a type of product innovation. If you wrote the most amazing prompt that gives me tweets that gets 100 likes every single time, even if all your product was a prompt on top of a model, you could gain some traction that way. And I just want to make this point because the prompt is a really key part here. But all that being said, I don't think this is a great tweet. I gave it this link, and what the model has done basically is looked at the sort of context, or it's kind of inferred that this is a new update. It's kind of inferred, or like it's read the text and it knows like that it's got something to do with Claude, but obviously it has no idea what Haiku 4.5 is or what it means. Is it faster? Faster than what? Is it like an announcement? Like it has no idea because the model has not looked at this URL. To improve the output of the agent and build a better social media posting agent that might make us rich and famous, we're going to need to give our model a way to go to that website and learn about the announcement. How do you suggest we do that? I'm gonna take a quick pause and look at the chat for a second. Oh, that's hilarious. That was the off. Yeah, okay. I think everyone knows what just happened. Um, don't worry, you didn't miss a ton. What I showed you in a nutshell is using Raycast's interface to use GPT-5 to generate the prompt for me. This is what it looks like. I then gave it to the agent in this format. You can have a quick read. And then we saw it pop up in the playground where I then prompted the agent to give us a tweet or a post. And then I observed that it didn't have a lot of context about the post. Our next task is to make sure that the agent can reach out to this web page and learn more details about the announcement. And my question to you, and I'll be coming back to the chat for a second as well, even though I'm sure you're bored of looking at me and you'd rather see the screen at this point. My question is, how would you suggest that we give our agent the ability to reach out to the web and access a page? I'm really sorry about the the screen thing. I think that's an accepted risk when you're doing this solo. Okay, so there's a few ideas here. Slavi said MCP. I see that's a good line of thoughts. Brave MCP, Selenium. That's an interesting idea. Mohammed, you're right on the money when you said EXA tool call. So essentially, we need to give our agent a tool that reaches out to the web and gets information about the page. There's a few different ways of doing that. We could just do a curl request and use something like Cheerio, which is like an NPM module to pass the web page. There are a ton of different APIs and things like that. We're going to use a tool that's been up and coming and very helpful for this purpose called EXA. EXA does two things. The first is you can give it a search query, like, for example, top e-bikes in London, and you can tell it how many search results you want and things like that. And it returns in a JSON object an array of all these search results. Really handy if you want to give your agent the ability to search the web. But in this case, we just want to crawl a page. For example, we want to crawl this blog post announcement on Claude's latest model. Honestly, I just got a bit distracted because I was like, wait, am I sharing my screen? But it's all good. And so we can, for example, give it the URL, we hit run, and then this is the JSON output. We get the title of the page, we get the URL, which we already know, as well as the text. And we have some handy options here. For example, we can check this context box, watch the difference in the output, whereas previously it was this text with a lot of new lines. What we'll get this time is a context argument like this that puts everything into one string, essentially, including the title. And I think it's slightly more compact. And then we can also enable something called an AI page summary. I'm pretty sure this will rack up your bill faster if you're using Exa, but for the purposes of our demo, we're just using it to give our agent a bit more of a steer on what's going on. We can use the summary to get the idea, and then we can use the full Exa of text to get the specific details. And so what our objective is now is to create a tool that will call out to Exa and give us this as a tool called results. And then our agent can actually look at this information to inform a better social media post. And so the way we're going to do this is, and I quite like Exa's DX here, you click on JavaScript and we can see that it's the Exa.js package. And so I'm just going to type pnpm install Exa.js. Because I lost a little bit of time to the screen not sharing, I'm going to copy over the code from something I prepared earlier. This is a crawl tool, and don't worry, we'll be looking at it in all the same depth, so you're not going to miss anything. Just note that I've already copied over my environment file, which has that environment variable in it. And so I'm not giving an API key, but you would need an account and an API key. And so, yeah, we have this tool defined. Let's go over to the social media agent. And in the tools object, we're going to give it the crawl tool like this. Now, as I mentioned before, the ID and the description are how the agent determines if it should call this tool. I'll just put in a little sample description, but because we're only giving our agent a handful of tools, it doesn't really matter that much. Like the agent will infer from the name crawl, it will use it to crawl a web page. But as you can imagine, with more complex agents, you have more tools, and then the importance of these descriptions becomes greater. What I like to do when I create a new tool, and I recommend you consider doing the same, is going to the Tools tab. As long as you've given that tool to an agent, it will show up here in the playground. And we can use it to just test the tool in isolation, just like any debugging technique, right? You want to break the problem down. And so we'll copy this URL, paste it into the tool input here. And if all goes to plan, we should see the output from the tool, which is very similar, isn't it, to what we saw in Exa. What's even cooler than this is if we go to the agent tab, and remember, we've already given the agent access to this crawl tool. I'll copy the same input. In fact, we can just run it here to compare. Remember, before it had like no specifics about the announcement, it really didn't know. But this time, if I ask it to generate a tweet about this, without really having to be too prescriptive, the model has figured out that it needs more information. It looked at what tools it has available. It realized it has this crawl tool, so it makes the request for us. And now it uses that output to produce something better. We get better coding performance at a fraction of the cost. I think that's really cool. I'm looking at the questions, and I really appreciate everyone letting me know that the screen wasn't working. I think you were trying to get my attention while I was doing it. Justin mentions the pricing isn't bad. That's an interesting point. Google also have a search tool. No, Noah, you're letting me know the screen's gone, but I'm just taking a little break to look at the chat. Like, don't blame you for being concerned, though. Okay, so we have 20 minutes left here. The next thing I want to do is actually post this post to Honestly, Twitter ideally, but their API is a bit annoying to work with. And so we're just going to use Blue Sky for this. So I don't really use Blue Sky, to be honest, but I just have an account for the purposes of having an account, I guess. Um, and to post to Blue Sky, we can use this handy little module called at-proto/API. I'm going to pnpm install that. And while it's installing, let me copy over the tool. We can move a bit faster now, right? Because we kind of get the core ideas. When we create a tool, we use a certain syntax, we implement the execute function, and we give it to the agent. And it really is that straightforward in a lot of cases. Here's the Blue Sky tool. Once again, we're pulling in the username and password from the environment variable. We're calling the API as such, and we're also extracting the URL output by the API call. The reason why we do this, and let me just be clear here, that when you define a tool, in addition to the ID and description, you define the arguments it takes in the form of an input schema. We haven't, this hasn't been as useful yet, but you also define an output schema. If you talk to, as I mentioned earlier in the stream, when you talk to a consumer app like ChatGPT, you just get this slew of text and it's great for reading. But if you want to use that programmatically, you want it represented as an object, you want it represented in a structured format. And this is what the output schema represents. Crucial, I don't really need the URI and CID. I could remove those if not for the risk of complicating the demo. What we really want is the URL, because when the agent posts to Blue Sky, we want to look at the URL of that posted entity in order to render it to the user and assure them that the post has been created. And so once again, we'll go to the social media agent and give it access to this new tool like so. We'll have to import it. And then over here in the playground, we'll follow the same steps. Actually, we'll just go to the Blue Sky post tool. I'll say hello world. I'll say remember to share your screen when presenting. Hashtag pro tip. And hopefully, if all goes well, and it's, well, it was rapid actually, it posted. And this is the URL for that post. I'll just delete it for the benefit of my 7 followers on Blue Sky. Let's then go to the agent. And what's really impressive, I think, is that if we, excuse me, I went to the weather agent, didn't I? If we go to the social media agent and we go to the previous thread, what I quite like about Mastra is that even though we just added a new tool, but we can just pick up in the same conversation. So I can say post that to Blue Sky. And if all goes well, I have a suspicion that this might not work because Blue Sky has a 300 character limit. I guess that was less than 300 characters. Despite the prompt, which gives it a guide to use less than 300 characters, sometimes the agent still can output more. And that's where certain prompting techniques come in handy. For example, with prompting, you might say, here's what I want from you. And then you give the agent a prompt that says, okay, but check your own work, double check it's under 300 characters. Or you give it things like penalties and you prompt it and say, absolutely do not use more than 300 characters. And sometimes by reinforcing that message, you will get a more consistent output. But ultimately, the nature of models is that they're non-deterministic. They think for themselves and can sometimes go a little bit off course, even with the best prompts. And there are some techniques to help with that, but we won't have time to go into those today. And so check it out. I'm one step closer to becoming famous on social media because I'm just going to post about all the latest news. Everyone's going to follow me, but I don't want to be on the computer all day. I don't want to be figuring out the latest topics. What I really want to do, ideally, is look at a data source of conversations and bulletins. And that's essentially what Hacker News is. How can we access Hacker News from our agent? You might have guessed, anytime we're trying to give our model access to something in the outside world, we give it a tool. But rather than code this tool from scratch, I want to use this as an opportunity to teach you a little bit about MCP, or Model Context Protocol. You might have heard MCP come up in recent months. It's been a very trendy subject. And it's trendy because people are excited about what it can unlock for them and their applications. I gave a presentation previously on MCP, so I can refer to this to let you know that it is a strict protocol used by models to standardize how they discover, describe, and interact with external tools. So whereas in our code so far, what we've done is created our own tools. If I want to reach out to Hacker News, I might Google for a Hacker News MCP server. And you can see that there are a couple that exist already. And these MCP servers, let me pick a good one. They usually document all the tools that they expose. So they have a search hacker news, it gets stories hacker news, gets story with comments. Rather than us implementing each of these tools, we can basically, with just a very few lines of code, just one or two really, we can let our model look at a database of tools, and that is the MCP server, essentially. Every MCP server exposes a schema, which is like a catalog of all the tools available, and then your model can just kind of pick from them when they're useful. What are some other examples? Well, the really nice thing about MCP is that there are a few different registries. At Mastra, we created the MCP registry because there were so many people trying to capitalize on the opportunity and also be helpful in the community by collecting all these things in one place. Uh, you can sort of go here and look at all the different. I like the Smithery one myself. You can go here and see all the different MCP servers available. So for example, if you wanted your agent to connect to Notion, you could build all your own tools, but Notion will have an existing MCP server with all of these tools created. You don't really have to do much, just point your agent at this MCP server. Browser-based, they have tools for basically interacting with a virtual web browser. So if you wanted to, X is great for crawling a website, but if you want to take action, especially on a website that's like a client-heavy single-page application or something, X wouldn't be great for that. But you could use browser-based to spin up a virtual browser, a little bit like Selenium, and start interacting with the browser. The way you set up an MCP server differs a little bit depending on if the MCP server is hosted remotely and you interface with it over HTTP, or if it's hosted locally and you interface with it using standard input and outputs. There isn't like a de facto hosted Hacker News MCP server. I think they would run into rate limits and things like that, and it's probably not worth the trouble. But I did find a really cool package, or excuse me, a really cool module called H10 MCP server, which we can reference. And so there's a couple of steps here. The first thing we have to do is pnpm install mastra/mcp. The MCP module is truly modular in that it's not included with the core. This means you only install what you need. And then in the agent, we're going to come up here and define a new MCP client. Here we specify the servers. Again, you could point to a URL, or you can point to a local process. In this case, it's going to spin up that. Essentially, it spins up a process that uses stdio to expose the catalog and allow you to interface with the tools and things like that. But when you get into the territory of needing to do authorization, for example, if you wanted to connect to like a Gmail MCP server or something, that would get a little bit tricky to run locally, especially with OAuth and things. And so in more realistic scenarios, your MCP server would likely be a URL. But for our fun example today, we're going to run it locally. How cool is this? We define the MCP client, we call the get tools function. Now we have this like whole buffet of tools that we can give to our agent. We just do that by destructuring the object like this along with the other tools. And I just can't believe how quickly this comes together. Sometimes it really impresses me to this day. Where's the playground gone? Here it is. We'll move it to the top. And as you can see, in addition to the tools we defined, we have all these Hacker News posts. Let's see if, or these Hacker News tools, excuse me. And so let's do this as if we're coming to it from scratch. So tell me about some trending Hacker News topics that coders would be interested in. Let's see what comes up. The model reasons that it should use the get stories post, and it returns in its output an array of, I think, 5 popular posts. These look a little bit outdated, I think. Perhaps there's a parameter to give it bias towards recency or sort by recency. We won't worry about that too much today. Let's ask it. So let's say we want to write about maybe Hyperflask, for example. We can ask it to pull out the link to the Hyperflask announcement post or page. Oh, it already had it in the context from the previous call, but if it didn't, it would basically call the get story tool to find out more information. We can also ask, what are people saying about it on Hacker News? And now it calls the get comments tool to figure out what people are saying about it. Maybe I can look at these opinions, see what's trending, and turn that into a really engaging post that gets me a bunch of affiliate revenue one day. Just taking a quick look at the chat while this chugs along. And so here are some of the takes. Okay. Take these opinions and write a pithy post for me to post on social media. Just came across the buzz around hyperflask on Hacker News, blah, blah, blah. And then we can say, post it. And if it's under 300 characters, for some reason, models are kind of bad at this. Like they sometimes spill over. Maybe I've been burned before because I'm flinching, but it's not really a problem so far. And there we go. We've posted it. Now, imagine if I treated this like a workflow and I ran it on a cron job every day or something like that. This is a very powerful social media posting engine that, by the way, I wouldn't implore anybody to actually use because tech Twitter is kind of overloaded with really bad AI bots right now. But isn't it fun to like illustrate the concepts and show how agents and tools and memory and MCPs come together in just a very short amount of time? So these were the main things I wanted to show you. I'm also going to show you how to connect it to your own custom UI. And if we have time, I'd also like to show you how to deploy this to Mastra Cloud. But let's take a quick breather to look at the chat and see if there are any questions I can answer. This is a good question about workflows. We won't go into workflows today just because we're going to focus on agents. Piotr asks about agent to agent. That is possible. Miguel is asking about auth workflows, like with the Notion MCP server. We won't be able to go into that into too much depth today, but it's certainly possible. Carlos is asking about deployment options. You can host Mastra anywhere, literally anywhere. You can run it as a process on a dedicated server. You can deploy it to serverless platforms. We're building cloud to give you the easiest way to deploy it, and we hope it'll provide the best experience eventually, but we don't care where you ship it. You should ship it wherever is best for you. Okay, let me show you how to connect this to your front end, because as fun as Playground is, as playful as it might be, naturally, you're not going to put Playground in front of your customers. You're going to want to connect this to your own user interface. Maybe you want to give a chat-based interface, but you can also use an agent to run almost like a function and give an output like a function. So yes, you might give someone a chat-based interface, but you could also have like a button on your interface that when the user presses it, it runs an agent, you get an output, and you render that in a traditional UI. Whatever you're trying to accomplish, you need to know how to interface with the Mastra server programmatically, and that's what I'm going to show you next. Rather than like code all this from scratch, which might take a little bit of time, I already have a complete code, a completed example here. The server is more or less identical to what we've created so far. I've also spun up a client. I'll show you both these. The only reason I point it out in the terminal like this is because I've set up a PNPM workspace to run them both at the same time in different process boundaries. And so we see the Vite is running here with our front end. This is a Next.js application. I'll show you the code for this in a second. And then we have the server running as well. I just like to, when I'm demoing, double check that this all looks good. As you can see, it literally is the same thing we just built together. I just prepared it earlier so that if there was an error or something like that, I could revert to it and we can build on it together. So when it comes to building a front end for your agent, you have a few different options. First of all, you can interface with the backend and read the response stream manually. That is an option you have, but it is quite effortful, right? And when I say streaming, think about when you interact with an agent and how the words kind of trickle in, right? What's unique about agents is that rather than waiting for the whole result before rendering in one big chunk, that feels slow and you don't really feel, you're not even confident the agent's on the right track. You don't trust it to run without a preview of what's going on. That streaming interaction is so important because the words trickle into the UI, allowing the user to get an idea of where it's going and give a steer. We won't go too much into the details about how that works, but you can read that stream manually and render it in your UI. But what you will often do when prototyping, or if you're building an app and you want to get up and running quickly, is you'll use one of these agentic UIs Like Mastra is completely compatible with AI SDK UI. You can also use things like Copilot kits. I really like AI SDK UI. Sometimes people think this is the same thing as AI SDK. It's actually a separate module, and it's essentially a React library that makes it easy to build interfaces on top of an agent. You also get these ShadCN AI elements for typical components, right? Things like having a message list that auto scrolls to the bottom, things like showing a tool call and its state. When trying to interact, let me just clean up the tabs here and open this in cursor. When you run the local dev playground, Mastra does expose some endpoints that you can call to interface with your agent. But when you're using AI SDK UI, which is what we're going to be doing, you need to create something of a shim, basically, which is where you define your own endpoint and you stream following Vercel's AI SDK formats. And we provide you with a handy utility function called toUI message stream response that ensures that what the server outputs is compatible with what the AI SDK UI is expecting. I'll show you that code in a moment. Let me just queue it up real quick because I think it would be helpful to get a preview of what we're talking about before looking at the code. Apparently, it's port 5173. And so check this out. I say hello, and it says, hello, how can I assist you today? Um, let's pull up that same, let's look at the M5 MacBook announcement to switch things up a little bit. Here's the new announcement. Write a tweet about in the style of MBK HD. The rendering is a bit messed here, but as you can see, it's the same exact behavior. It calls out to the tool. Here's the input, here's the output, here's the new tweets. We can do all those same things we did before. How does this work and how can you do it in your application? Well, essentially, AI SDK UI makes it pretty easy. You get this use chat hook. You point it at that endpoint, that shim we just created that returns the agent stream in a format that AI SDK UI is expecting. And the library gives you these state variables. Firstly, principally the messages state variable. This triggers a UI we render every time a tool call result trickles in, every time an agent response trickles in. We use this below to map over the messages, and we use these message components from AI UI, or what's it called? AI elements to render it cohesively. You could do all this manually by reading the bits and bytes essentially, but it's generally a lot easier to use a library like this or Copilot Kit or Assistant UI or something like that. We can also do some branching. So if it's a tool call, we render one of those tool components. You probably don't need me to show you what that is because it's fairly intuitive, right? One last thing I'll point out before we wrap up here and defer to questions. Unfortunately, we have run out of time to deploy to cloud right now, but that's okay. I can point you at some resources to do that afterwards. What I wanted to point out is that when you go to the agent, for example, the social media agent down here, yes, we're giving that to Mastra's playground and it's taking care of all the interactions, but you can literally call, like you can say const text equals await social media agent.generate, and you can give it an input, and then you could log the text in a CLI.ts file, for example. You can also stream, so you can do like social media agent.stream, you give it an input. Oops. And then you want to get the text stream, or actually, we don't want to wait here. Oh, I see. We do stream like this. And then you can iterate over the stream in this manner. Yeah, like this. And you could also do this in like your CLI if you wanted. So we can call this CLI.generate object, and this one is like CLI.stream. But yeah, you get the idea. You can interface with this agent in different ways. And so, yeah, we've got maybe just 2 or 3 minutes here just to look at the chat and see any questions. keep an eye out. If you registered here on Luma, keep an eye out for an email that's going to have a link to the code, as well as some of these additional resources I mentioned, like deploying to cloud. We have a guide on that, for example. It's a good question about constraints, like limiting the character length to 300. So, as I mentioned, agents are like the brain for your behavior of your application, right? And so you're really entrusting them to follow the instruction, but that you have varying degrees of success with that. And when it comes to something open-ended, they're pretty amazing. But when you really need to like, you know, put like you need something really specific out of the agent, that's when you can start to get a bit frustrated and you might lose confidence that your agent is behaving as you would like it to in production in front of your users. We haven't really looked at this in any great depth today, simply because it would make the workshop too long. But Mastra has another feature called workflows, which I can show you very quickly before we wrap up. And unfortunately, this will be the last question we take, but you can also find me on. Oh, don't worry, I will definitely share my screen. I'm making that mistake twice. You can find me on X, and if you want to DM me, literally my DMs are open to help with Mastra. But as you can see, there's I think because earlier when I scuffed it by putting the uh, workflows, I think the weather workflow is still here. Oh, I must have removed the weather workflow from the completed code project. That's too bad. But conceptually, a workflow is a way to orchestrate the steps of your agent. And so, whereas an agent does all the decision making for you, a workflow allows you to orchestrate discrete steps that put you in the driver's seat. You can still call out into an agent to do more scoped and specific tasks, but you have these kind of checkpoints along the way that allow you to apply constraints, like making sure the output is a certain length, also to pause for human input and things like that. I made a couple of videos about this on the Master YouTube channel, and since we're talking about it, I'll include a link in the follow-up email as well. Kevin's asking if you can use Mastra in conjunction with LangGraph or any Python framework. The fun thing about coding is that you can interface with anything, everything. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me because they use different programming languages, and generally everything that those tools can do, Mastra can do as well. So I'm not sure what the use case would be here as well. There's a great question here from AJ about incorporating into like a Flutter application. That I'm not too familiar with Flutter, but because the way you interface with the agent is over HTTP, essentially, that's a platform and a language agnostic protocol. So it's absolutely possible. I wouldn't wish it upon you to do that unless you have a really specific use case. It's possible that things like there might be existing tools and libraries and developer tools that can make that easier for you. That's definitely something I would like to learn a bit more about. And if you DM me, we can look into that together. Okay, folks, thank you so much for tuning in. I had so much fun going through all this stuff, and I'm only a little bit embarrassed that I wasn't sharing my screen for some of it, but I appreciate everybody hanging on there. I think we picked up okay. I love how much ground we got to cover in such a short amount of time, right? We got an introduction to the agents. We built our own agent first by scaffolding it with Create Mastra, but then we used that base to copy the primitives over, make small changes, and build something actually pretty useful in not a lot of time. I wouldn't use this agent to like post slop, but one of the coolest things about using AI tools is they help me brainstorm and they help me refine things. And then I tell it what good looks like, and then I post it. And this agent could be genuinely useful for that purpose. But of course, it's just a blueprint. You can adapt this for all types of different use cases. I'm sure when you saw that registry of MCP servers and all the different tools from like Notion integrations to integrations with different databases and things like that, you can imagine how this could be used to build something even more powerful and more bespoke to what you care about and what you're trying to accomplish in your business. Again, if you register to the event, you'll get an email with things like the source code and a link to the YouTube video. We stream these over on YouTube, and that's where you can find the recording. I've been Alex Boker with Mastra. Thank you so much for watching.